So welcome everybody to our September 10 plant tour of the Nash County Arboretum. This month's tour is called 10 Plants That Appear in Literary Works. A lot of our tours are focused more on, landscape concepts or horticulture concepts, but once or twice a year I like to do these topics that are a little bit more, abstract, I guess. So I thought it would be fun. I know a lot of us like to read, and we find references to plants in our readings, and so I've picked out 10 of those that we can find here in the Arboretum, and we'll look around and see those today. I will say it was a little harder for me to find 10 plants this month than some of the other months, only because a lot of times the authors are not real specific. So they might reference, a tree or a flower, but they don't get real specific in every instance about what type of tree or what type of flower it is. For example, there's, hundreds of thousands of references to lilies in literature, but it's very rare that they specify exactly which lily they're talking about. So at first that made it a little bit of a hurdle for me putting the list together, and then I realized after a while that actually was giving me a whole bunch of artistic license to just make up whatever plants I wanted. You'll see a couple of examples of that as we go, I guess. So we've got 10 plants to talk about, and the first one is just behind me here, so if you'll follow me this way. All right, so our first plant is a rose. Rose is another one where there's hundreds of thousands of examples of references to rose in poetry and novels and whatnot. So I found a reference by Shakespeare, and of course everybody knows the reference from Romeo and Juliet. What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. But that's not the reference we're using, because that would be way too obvious, right? So there's other instances in which Shakespeare talks about roses. And there's one from a sonnet in which he says, "I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses I see in her cheeks." So there's actually a group of roses referred to as damasked roses. They are in a class of what we would consider old garden roses, so roses that were introduced or hybridized before 1900. So they've been around for more than 100 years. And our rose garden here is sort of divided into sections. So this whole back right quadrant is old garden roses. And a few of them are damasks. This one here is a damask. This is Ispahan. It doesn't have any flowers on it, so I didn't really want to talk about it today. This is our other damask, and it only has a couple flowers hiding in the back there, but I thought since it was in bloom, it would be worth talking about. The damask roses, again, are old garden roses. They've been around for quite a long time. This particular one was introduced in 1880. It's got kind of a rosy pink double blossom, and the fragrance of roses varies quite a bit. Some of them are extremely fragrant and others not so much. This particular one has a lot of fragrance. I don't always pick up fragrance very well. I don't have a very keen sense of smell, but if you want to explore the fragrance of that, you're welcome to sort of stick your nose in there as we move along. On this one, you will see a little bit of black spot. Many of our roses are remarkably disease resistant. We've picked out roses for that characteristic because a lot of gardeners, deal with problems like powdery mildew and black spot and other issues that roses are prone to getting. And so one of the things we try to do is show you roses that are more resistant to some of those problems. This one, late in the season, is showing some evidence of black spot. but it holds up really well throughout the year. And by September, to have a few spots on the leaves is not such a big deal. It's much more disease resistant than a lot of the hybrid teas, which are going to get black spot as early as May in a lot of years. So a pretty good performer for us. Any questions about this one? All right. Next plant is chrysanthemum. So the literary reference here is a short story by John Steinbeck called The Chrysanthemums. It's about sort of a, not exactly a troubled marriage, but sort of an unfulfilling marriage. So the wife is sort of forlorn because her husband is not willing or not able to give her children, so she sort of takes to her garden and the chrysanthemums in particular as sort of a replacement for children. So she puts a lot of care into raising her chrysanthemums and looks after them, and for a brief time her husband sort of notices that the chrysanthemums are looking well and kind of praises her for caring after them, and there's a little bit of hope that will inspire some sort of romantic rekindling, but I think at the end of the short story that doesn't, it's sort of left open whether that's actually going to happen or not. So as far as the horticultural characteristic, chrysanthemums are of course a popular plant this time of year in the fall time. They bloom late in the season. The reason they bloom in fall is because their flowers open in response to short day length. And the reason I know that is in college I worked for a professor who was sort of this mad scientist, and he would always try to trick chrysanthemums into blooming in the springtime as kind of an experiment. And so I would go into the greenhouse every day during the spring semester, and I would put these black tarps over the nursery benches to restrict the amount of light the chrysanthemums would have each day. We'd give them about 8 hours of sunlight and then darkness the rest of the day. And we could make them bloom in May instead of September or October by doing that. It's probably a little bit tedious for the average person to do, but it was fun and I got paid for it. So chrysanthemums, we sometimes think of them as an annual plant. We get them in the fall and they bloom, and then we kind of toss them or throw them away or forget about them. They're actually a perennial plant, so if you plant them in the ground, they're going to come back year after year. They need a little bit of help to perform in subsequent years. Usually we'll kind of pick the flower buds off early in the season to sort of encourage them to grow a little bit thicker and fuller. And you can pick the flower buds off from about the time they emerge in the spring until probably the 4th of July or so. And that will allow the plants to get big and expand and produce a lot of flowers in the fall. Any questions about chrysanthemums?
I heard that you should actually cut them back at around June, July. Is that true? You just kind of cut them back to help them grow better?
Yeah, that's the same concept as picking the buds off.
Same thing, not just cutting them all the way down like to the ground or anything.
I wouldn't cut them all the way back, but if you're just if you're picking the tips off of each little part, then you're gonna create that fuller look. But any later than about the 4th of July, and you'll start to kind of have an adverse effect. So you don't want to do it too late.
That's what I heard. End of June, 1st of July.
Yep. Yep.
Will they grow under a tree that sucks most of the water? I mean, how much
they need a good amount of water. They're kind of like hydrangeas. They're one of the first things to start to droop if they're feeling dry. So they need a lot of water, and they also need a lot of sun. So I wouldn't put them directly under a big tree. Even though they only want about 8 hours of sun a day, they want it to be full sun during that period. They don't want to be in the shade. So I mentioned earlier there's lots of references to lilies, and there was one particular lily I wanted to talk about that has a red flower, so I just kind of manipulated my search terms and came up with a book called The Red Lily Crown by Elizabeth Lupus. So this is a book set in, I think, the 1500s in Italy, and it's a fictional story about a royal family, and whoever wears the red lily crown is the ruler of the city of Florence, apparently. So, so that's the reference I'm using, but there's, literally hundreds of thousands of references to lilies in different literary works. So the plant that I want to talk about is a very cool plant. Be even cooler in about 5 days if you want to come back and look at it then. So this is a plant called the magic lily, or sometimes called surprise lily, or resurrection lily, or spider lily. It has many, many different names. But all of those names kind of refer to the characteristic of this plant to sort of disappear for much of the year, and then just magically sort of reappear early in the fall after a big rainstorm. And that's what you're seeing now. These little flower shoots have just come up within the last few days. And in about 3 to 5 days or so, the flowers will be open. They're sometimes called spider lilies because the petals are kind of long and slender and look like the legs of a spider. These are part of a group of plants called Lycoris. Lycoris are bulbs that all have this sort of disappearing and reappearing characteristic. So the general period that Lycoris will bloom is anywhere from the beginning of August until the end of October. So depending on the species of Lycoris, it will bloom at different times. The most common one is this red one, but they also come in yellows and purples and other colors as well. They do have foliage early in the spring. They put out a little tuft of foliage that looks sort of like liriope, long slender leaves. And that'll be out for maybe 6 to 8 weeks or so, and then it kind of disappears, and again, you sort of forget about the plants, and then they reappear as these single flower stalks later in the year. So, any questions about those? It may be. I've never heard that particular name.
And where can you find anything but red? I've seen whites, and other than ordering them, there's, of anybody around that sells them actually?
I don't see them for sale in nurseries. Usually it's mail order bulb catalogs or perennial catalogs that have them. Some of the magic lilies and bulbs in general in this garden have come from Terracea Farms, which is in, I believe it's Beaufort County. But yeah, generally bulbs you're going to have to order from mail order nurseries. You don't see them in local nurseries.
And last question, my bulbs like that have come up out of the ground this year. They've never come out of the ground. This year they're completely uncovered. Should I put them back?
Yeah, I would try to get them underground. Could be something like a squirrel is disturbing them, or something like that. Okay, so the next plant is inspired by the book Where the Red Fern Grows. So this is a children's story. I think I read it in 4th or 5th grade. So in Where the Red Fern Grows, the main character's name is Billy. And he sort of has like a flashback of sorts to when he was a child. And as a child, he had saved up some money to adopt 2 puppies, which he named Old Dan and Little Ann. And after, living a life with those puppies and, having all the sorts of experiences that children have with their pets, they had kind of a bad experience. Billy was, I guess, camping out in the mountains and got attacked by a mountain lion, and the 2 dogs sort of rescued him, but in the process of doing so suffered injuries that caused them to die. So he buried the two pets, and in between them planted a red fern. So We are in our woodland garden. Woodland garden has a lot of shade, and we have plants that like to grow in shady conditions. And we have lots of different types of ferns. And there's a particular cultivar here called Brilliance. Many of the autumn ferns, they're green now, of course, but when they come out in the spring, they have sort of a copper orangey or copper red color to them as the new foliage emerges. And then gradually throughout the first few weeks of spring, that color will change from orange to green. So that's as close as I could get to a red fern. Ferns generally like shady conditions. They like sort of a moist, average moist soil. They don't like to be dry. They like kind of woodland conditions, so generally organic soil, kind of a humusy type soil. They're relatively pest-free. They don't have many disease or insect issues. Generally resistant to some of the animals that graze on plants, so you won't generally have issues with rabbits or deer. And in fact, we've started using a lot more ferns here to sort of deter deer that were causing issues with other plants, including acuba and hosta and some other things that we have that deer really, really like. So this is another plant where I've used a little bit of artistic license to come up with a reason to talk about it. This was inspired by the Hunger Games series, which of course there's a series of books that was then made into a series of movies. So the main character of the Hunger Games series is Katniss Everdeen. There is a part early in the series where Katniss is sort of being taught or trained by her father to survive in the wilderness, I guess. And he points out a type of berries called nightlock berries. And he says, "Not these, Katniss, never these. They're nightlock. You'll be dead before they reach your stomach." Okay, so they establish that nightlock is this deadly, poisonous berry. And then later on in the story, during the Hunger Games event, the nightlock comes back, and Katniss sort of uses her knowledge of those berries to her advantage to ultimately win the Hunger Games. So here's the thing. Nightlock is not a real plant. It's a fictional plant. However, it seems fairly likely that, based on the name nightlock, that they were inspired or derived from two separate plants which have poisonous characteristics. So there's a plant known as deadly nightshade, and there's another that is poison hemlock. So the night from nightshade and the lock from hemlock becomes nightlock. So this is not poison hemlock, but it's eastern hemlock. It's the closest we could get, so that's what we're going to talk about. So just like we have, English ivy and poison ivy, and they're not really related, they just share a name. Eastern hemlock and poison hemlock are not related plants, but they do have a similar name. Poison hemlock is a small plant that you would see in woodland areas or weedy areas, whereas this is a tree. So eastern hemlock is something that we have in this arboretum just sort of for display purposes. It's not really well suited to our particular part of the world. Hemlocks grow better in mountainy areas, so you see them along the Appalachians, the western part of our state and further north. In eastern North Carolina, they're generally a short-lived tree. They won't get nearly as tall as they will in their mountain habitat. But we have it here, just so people can kind of see what it looks like. And it does have a really interesting kind of needle leaf foliage that's a little bit more delicate than cypress or cedar or some of these other evergreens that we grow. Eastern hemlocks in the mountains are having some major issues with an invasive pest called the woolly hemlock adelgid. So it's an insect that is causing some serious defoliation to hemlocks in a lot of areas. So even in the areas where this tree grows more comfortably, it's got a lot of pest pressure that's causing it problems. So I don't necessarily recommend that you plant this in your home gardens, but if you do, expect that it's going to be a short-lived plant that won't stay around for very long. Any questions? We do actually use some of this in our wreath making workshops. You know, again, it's a nice looking foliage. It's kind of more delicate than some of the other evergreens, but just as a landscape plant in our area, it's not really a good fit. So in To Kill a Mockingbird, there are two young children, a brother and a sister, Scout and Jem, and they have a house in their neighborhood that's inhabited by a person named Boo Radley. They've never seen Boo Radley. They've heard stories about him, and they sort of think that he's, you know, sort of a ghost or you know, kind of a scary figure, and they're a little bit nervous about Boo Radley at the beginning of the story because they've never seen this man. They've just heard stories about him. Over the course of the story, they find a series of, I guess what you would call gifts in a knothole in an oak tree. And they realize at some point in the story that those gifts are being left to them by Boo Radley. And that is one of the things that sort of helps them realize that he's not this bad guy, he's not this scary figure, he's more friend than foe. I don't think they ever actually state what kind of oak tree that they were finding these gifts in. But we've got a number of willow oaks here, so I just thought I would talk about those. Willow oaks are a very common tree in the southeastern United States. They're used in all sorts of urban environments, so parking lots and sidewalks and things like that. They're probably too big for that use. So, you know, it would be smart for people to maybe stop doing that, but for a long time that was a tree that you would see planted in those types of areas. And I think what you can see on some of these trees behind me is they drop a lot of leaves and they drop a lot of limbs. So you can see some bare branches here and there that are hanging. That's a general characteristic of the tree in and of itself, but I think it's made worse when they're in these sort of urban environments where they don't have as much room for their roots to grow as they would in a more open landscape. So the fact that they're sort of restricted by the curb and the pavement and things like that, you know, probably doesn't help the performance of the tree. They are, you know, when they grow well, they are a nice looking tree, but as they shed, you know, some of their branches, they become a little bit more of a nuisance and maybe not quite as attractive. All right, so the other plant that comes from To Kill a Mockingbird is nutsedge. Nutsedge is a plant that's sometimes mistakenly referred to as nut grass or water grass. I say mistakenly because it's not actually a grass. And that's important because some of the herbicides that you would use to kill a weedy grass are not going to kill something like sedge, nutsedge, which is a pretty awful weed. So if you're trying to get rid of nutsedge and you're thinking it's a grass, then you're going to perhaps have a lot of difficulty getting rid of it. In To Kill a Mockingbird, it comes up because one of the children I mentioned earlier, Scout, was talking about one of her other neighbors and said that neighbor loved everything that grew in God's earth, even the weeds. The only exception was that if she found a blade of nutgrass in her yard, it was like the Second Battle of the Marne. One sprig of nutgrass can ruin a whole yard. So, what we're going to do is we're going to find one sprig of nutgrass. Kelsey has done it. And how did you know that that was nutgrass or nut sedge?
So I knew by the seed head that it was nut sedge because it has like the little spiky balls. But if you don't have a seed head, you can always look at the stem because the stem is triangular rather than round.
All right, any other questions about nut sedge?
What can you use to kill it?
Okay, so herbicides that you would use to control grass, or even herbicides like Roundup, which are sort of general purpose, don't really work on nut sedge. There are products that are specific to sedges. The one that's probably most common and easy to find for homeowners, the chemical is called imazaquin, and the product that you see in stores is called Image. There are, it's of course has to be a little bit extra confusing. There's multiple products that have the brand name Image, but the Image product that has imazaquin as the active ingredient is generally the best homeowner product for nut sedge. So this is the part of the tour where we're going to talk about the much maligned Bradford pear tree. So I have to do this every once in a while with plants like Bradford pear or Leland cypress that I don't like all that much. Occasionally I do have to say good things about them. So this, first of all, why is this on the tour? What's the inspiration? It comes from the book Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. So the character Janie in that story, her first kiss was under a blooming pear tree, and they sort of return to the pear symbol or pear imagery several times throughout the story to sort of show her journey and her maturation and her evolving into womanhood. So that's how it fits into the theme. As far as the horticulture characteristics, the reason we generally, I talk bad about pear trees is because they're overplanted. They're weak wooded, so they split a lot. They're another one of those trees that's damaged easily by wind. The flowers kind of have a bad smell to them. They're invasive because they are spread by seed and come up in areas you don't want them to. So they have a lot of negative characteristics. And their main positive characteristic, their flower bloom, is pretty short and, arguably not even that impressive. But one of the things that I think is underrated about pear trees is they can actually have some pretty nice fall color in certain years. And so that's why I stopped at this tree rather than, we've got 2 or 3 other pear trees down the line. This one is starting to change color a little bit. So you can see a few leaves that have a little bit of red or yellow on them. Sometimes you'll get a little bit of purple on some of these leaves. Like any deciduous tree that changes color, some years it's going to pop a little bit more than others. And it's probably never going to be as nice as a sugar maple, but it does have some nice fall color in some years. So I thought I would take a moment to point that out. But don't plant Bradford pears. Don't do it. Any questions? All right, so this is a deodar cedar. This was, the inspiration for this is Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. There's many references to cedars in the story. It's obviously the word cedar is in the title. But in particular, 2 of the primary characters, Ishmael and Hatsui, have sort of a special cedar tree that they found that has a hollow trunk. And so they return to that cedar tree several times throughout the story for conversations and romantic encounters and that sort of thing. so that's you know, a big part of that story. This particular cedar is a deodar cedar. It's another tree that's, you know, can grow in our area, but probably not the best part of the world to grow this particular tree. In a cooler climate, these trees would live a longer life than they do in eastern North Carolina. We probably would have an expected lifespan for this tree in this part of the world of about 25 to 30 years. This tree is probably about 18 to 20 years old. And you can sort of see, looking at this tree, that the left side is pretty full and green, and this right side is much more sparse. And usually when you see something that dramatic on a tree or a plant of any sort, you can sort of trace it down to an issue with the root system. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on here, but something on the roots on the side of this plant that I'm on, which I think is my right, something's going on with that root system, so that, you know, nutrients or water or whatever is not moving through the plant on that side the way that it should. If you were to look closer at the foliage actually looks pretty healthy. It's just not nearly as much of it on this side of the tree as the other side. So I think we're probably pretty safe in saying that this tree is on the second half of its lifespan and probably won't be here a whole lot longer. But it's a nice looking tree. It has a really interesting shape. You know, the branches kind of come out like like a U shape, but then they kind of go back down, curl back down at the tip. So you get a little bit of an arching, weeping effect. It's got a really nice, you know, color to it. So it's kind of this bluish green tint that's a little bit different than other plants in the landscape. So they're an interesting looking plant, a really nice plant, but just not one that's going to be around for a long time. All right, so the last plant on our tour is Morning Glory. This is another plant that there's so many references to morning glories in poetry and literature that it's hard to pick just a particular one. But I consulted an expert. My sister is very knowledgeable on, you know, literature and poetry and things like that. So when I was composing or compiling this tour, I should say, I reached out to my sister Katie and I said, can you think of any literary works that have, you know, references to plants? And she gave me quite a few, some of which we've already heard about. But one of them was a poem called Morning Glory that she sent me. So that's why I picked this plant, is that particular poem. And I'm going to read that poem to you to conclude the tour. How about that? All right. I guess I should tell you about the plant before I read the poem, and then we'll just kind of drop the mic on the poetry. So morning glories are an annual vine. They have kind of a tubular shaped flower that is open in the morning and then closes during the day. So there are some partially open flowers on the back side here, but most of them are closed up. There's actually several different genuses of plants that are referred to as morning glories, which is a little bit unique. It's not a single genus of plants necessarily. Some of them are more aggressive seed spreaders than others, so they can be quite weedy. We try to use the ones in the garden that aren't quite as aggressive, but sometimes they escape and they pop up in places we don't want them. But sort of the traditional use of morning glories is on a pole or a mailbox or someplace, a little arch like this where they can climb. And they're really, you know, pretty and attractive, but they can be aggressive and weedy if they're allowed to be. So So with that, I will read the poem Morning Glories by Mary Oliver. And if you wanna do the snaps, that's fine, you know. Create some ambiance for the poetry. All right, Morning Glories by Mary Oliver. Blue and dark blue, rose and deepest rose, white and pink, they are everywhere in the diligent cornfield, rising and swaying in their reliable finery, in the little fling of their bodies, their gear and tackle all caught up in the cornstalks. The reaper's story is the story of endless work, of work careful and heavy, but the reaper cannot separate them out. There they are in the story of his life, bright, random, useless, year after year. Taken with the serious tons, weeds without value, humorous, beautiful weeds. All right, so that's our poem about morning glories. Any questions about morning glory or any of the other plants we talked about today?
I just pulled up some native plants and morning glories this morning.
All right. So they were growing somewhere you didn't want them? Yeah. They are pretty plants, but they can become weedy very easily. Well, thank you everyone for coming to this month's tour, and maybe we'll see you again in October. Thank you very much.